speech. So I thought maybe just to kick things off is I would read my speech, because it just gives a bit of an introduction to my relationship with Ennis and how much I love his work. And then I've got a few questions for him. We might just have a bit of a Q&A. Ennis might read a story or two, and then we might just open it up to a Q&A from the audience. How does that sound? Thank you all for coming tonight. So I'm going to start about talking about Ennis by talking about myself, which really won't be much of a surprise. But when I started my role as publishing director at Penguin Random House at the end of 2019, despite having worked in publishing for many years across various roles, I never actually published a book myself. And when Michael Williams from the Wheeler Centre sent through the proposal and manuscript for Sadvertising, I knew straight away that I wanted it to be the first book that I ever signed. I instantly responded to the humour and absurdity and surrealism and the satire, the sheer wild energy, the nowness of it, his sense of being a third culture kid and a stranger in a strange land. And I couldn't think of an Australian work that I'd read that is anything like it. Like Ennis, I have a background in marketing, and like him, I'm fascinated by advertising and brands, copywriting, the workings of agencies, consumer behaviour, and most of all, the nexus between creativity and commerciality. And I immediately fired off an extremely enthusiastic email filled with compelling reasons as to why I was the only publisher in the country who could possibly do it justice. And then in what feels like 100 years ago, in the before COVID times, Ennis and I got to meet, and I felt anyway, clicked right away. And we signed a deal, and I feel that it's been a dream partnership ever since. Ennis is everything a publisher could wish for in an author. Super smart, boundlessly enthusiastic, completely dedicated to his craft, hardworking, happy to take feedback, delighted with every little win along the way, completely collaborative, flexible, accommodating, and 100% an artist, without ever losing sight of the fact that publishing is a business and that you're building a brand and that you have to get out there and work the room and sell the sizzle. Additionally, he has the great gift and good fortune of being intensely likeable and instantly charming everything he meets. Mostly though, and I think this is what comes through so strongly in the book, despite its themes of alienation, ennui, and the gods and muses who stalk his prose, he is a humanist in the truest and best sense of the word. Compassionate, empathetic, truly creative, dedicated to the transforming power of art, besotted with words, and open to new experience and new ideas, and boundlessly curious and in love with life. And that is what I love about his work, and that is what I love about working with him. And so, Ennis, you'll always be my first as a publisher, say again. And I'm extremely proud to be with you here again, to launch this book again, at the beginning of what I know will be a brilliant career. So one of the things that I neglected to ask you throughout this whole process, and I was really gratified to read in a couple of interviews, was the title. And, you know, a couple of people have already picked it as their favourite title of the year. So can you talk a bit about the title and where it comes from?
That question came up quite a lot. And Sadvertising is actually an industry term that we use in marketing to talk about classify sad communication. So it's essentially emotional comms advertising that pulls at your heartstrings and tries to make you cry. So it is a literal term that we use in advertising. And for a long time, that's, you know, we kind of, for a period, writing, advertising might be very optimistic. Then we did humor. So there's a period sometime in sort of mid-2000s where it became very sad. But I've always been really drawn to the term because it's one of those blend words, sad, advertising together. And the moment I saw it, I kind of realized that's everything my work is kind of about. It's bringing words together in a way that advertising is also really, really fun and it's exciting and it can do so much. It's also can be said. So from memory, I think it might have been somebody in my agency who suggested it. But I just remember that I was drawn to it right away, and I kind of knew that was a title that encapsulated the world of yeah. I mean, somebody on the radio the other day said, "It's really funny. Shouldn't it be called Laughvertising?" I was like,
Same ring. Never worked as a copywriter on same radio. So there's a lot of tech, and engagement with tech in the book. But as I said in my little intro, I think a lot of what the book is kind of striving for is trying to work out what it means to be human in this world at the moment, and how that's mediated through technology or social media or brands or consumerism. And I think in a way, one of the things you're trying to do is understand humanity through consumerism, which is something that we're all caught up in, and that we all kind of participate in, whether we like it or not. And so I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I think it has partly to do with, it definitely is my interest in advertising, the act of advertising, the act of branding, the act of marketing, and it's a world that we kind of tend to live in constantly. And at times we analyze it, and times we analyze it with a lot of disdain. Constantly, we don't want this, use ad blockers and so forth. But I think for me, it was really about trying to understand the modern condition through this lens of advertising, consumerism, technology, because I felt that that is a world that I fundamentally understood from the perspective of being someone who consumes it, but also someone who creates it. So I felt like I was in this kind of enviable position in perhaps to try and put together a book that really draws on all of those ideas of trying looking at the engine of capitalism, if you call it that, an advertising agency, but also somebody who, for some weird reason, advertising just works. I can't escape. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other reasons why I needed this book to be my first book. I also, as somebody who comes from a migrant background, there's an expectation that I have to write this book about a migrant story. That was never really my perspective, because I think your history is only one part of who you are. And, I think Sadvertising came at the right moment. It came out of a need. It came out of office frustration, and it just came to me very naturally. And it just started writing itself. And I realized quite immediately that once I had the voice, once I had that sardonic voice, that's what I had to pursue. And it had to be through this lens, because I thought I have to analyze our culture and the condition that we're in through that, because we're so engrossed by it. Like, you can't escape it. It's like, where do you go without a land?
Well, there's lots of great writers who started off in advertising.
So, Peter Carey did say he owes everything to advertising. So I was like, I'm going to say that, but
So you work as a copywriter, where your job is to kind of, craft copy that hopefully convinces people to sell something.
Yeah.
And so what's this tension there between your job and your work as a kind of creative writer? Do you feel that there is one? Do you feel that your copywriting work informs your writing practice, or do you try to kind of push it out? Or
well, I studied marketing and I studied creative writing. So, and I love both of those things. But there is conflict, definitely. I think conflict is natural in kind of any. It's kind of hard to combine your kind of personal creativity with your kind of commercial creativity. Somehow, I don't know how I found a way to talk about both through the lens that I needed it to be. Like, it had to be literate. But at times I often thought I wasn't a very good copywriter. I might have been a better strategist. But and yeah, I think that's kind of where the line is.
do you find yourself like taking words out? Because copywriting is all about.
I think that.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, I mean, like,
so you always want to get rid of the adverbs and
yeah,
put in action.
it's also about, I think what I one thing I was very, very conscious of when I was writing Sadvertising is the idea of a short story. I didn't want the short story. I didn't want the kind of formulaic version of what a short story is. So I looked for ways to escape that. And I think through the help of my mentorship, a writer called Nam Lee, I was really able to expand my world of an understanding of what a story could be. And I kind of became unafraid to kind of go, oh, fuck it, I'm just going to write a story. It's just going to be like a list of keys for the financial crisis. Or, I'm going to try and then tell this narrative in the briefest way possible, because that's the moment that I want to focus on. I'm going to talk about a character, and how she has a difficulty with her mother or something like that. I kind of just drew in a moment with her obsession about Twitter. So I think having that, the mentorship definitely helped me build confidence and understanding of how I could push through those genres in a way. And that was really helpful. And I think there's also like a really strange egotistical confidence that you have in the first book. You just think you're going to be the greatest ever. It's weird.
You talk a bit more about how you and Matt worked together on the book.
So for those of you who don't know, Natalie is I think one of Australia's greatest writers. He's a writer's writer. He wrote a book about 12 years ago, and I've been obsessed with Natalie since the book came out. I was just nervous. So when he acknowledged that he wanted to become my mentor, I was mind blown. I couldn't believe it. I had to really work myself up to meet him and go to the pub and talk to him. They're quite drunk, actually. But yeah, I mean, I was in this really amazing position where I had a contract with Nam Lee. Like the Wheeler Center put together a contract, and this is what I want to get out of this mentorship, and this is what Nam's going to give me. So I wrote my parts, he wrote his part, we signed it, and that was it. I was like, I got a contract. Like, you can't, like, you got to abide to this contract. So yeah, we signed it. Yeah, I wrote down, I want to learn the art of fiction from Nam Lee. And that was, I think I quit my job. I moved to Sarajevo in my homeland, and I found a really cheap apartment. I used the $15,000 that I got from the brand, and I just didn't leave the house. I just got a stack of cigarettes and sausages. But Nam was very structured. We kind of had this, I would send him stories in batches. Every second month, I'd send him a batch of stories. He'd read them. He'd give me some line-by-line feedback, global feedback about the stories, and then we'd get on a phone call and talk about it for about 2 to 3 hours. Literally go through every story. The first time I did it, I was so scared because I was like, my head's everything. It's just, what's the point? But he was very kind. As critical as he was, he really admired my ambition and understood it, and kind of found a pattern where that really, really worked. So I basically used all the insight that I had from the initial batches just to craft, make sure that every batch that was just better. Until we got to a point where we're like, okay, let's start editing. So that's the process. I think it worked amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly super strong when it came through to us.
Yeah.
And did you find the experience of then working with me and Genevieve, who's Ennis Cehic, was that very different from working with them?
But that was great. That was amazing. Genevieve was incredible. Like I there's so much more that I didn't really like with Nam. It was a very different journey. But I think what I loved about what we did, because there's so many stories, we had to get an Excel spreadsheet. Write them all out. So we had a spreadsheet, write all the stories out, what they're about, and the titles, and it was like, oh my God, like I didn't think I'd ever use an Excel spreadsheet ever again. And there I was. The first one using a spreadsheet.
One of the things we talked about is like, because we jettisoned a few stories, because we wanted to create this sort of little Sadvertising universe.
Yeah.
And we felt that, a couple as good as they were didn't
kind of
fit into that little hermetically sealed world.
There was a lot that we took out.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
You touched on before about being a migrant writer, and that you don't want to be pigeonholed as a migrant writer, or you want to address how migrants are portrayed in society and in literature. And I think in publishing, often migrant stories are very particular types of stories and often follow similar sorts of paths. And so I wonder if you could talk about how you bring your experience to your work, and particularly to this work.
Yeah, I think I was always afraid of being pigeonholed. And I think it's also you don't always have an idea of everything you're going to write. Sometimes you think, oh, I'm going to write science fiction, and then you kind of hear, like, if you end up writing, this particular story, it's going to be very difficult for you to publish. I think Michael Muhammad Ahmad said less as well. And so there is I think as somebody who comes from a marginalized background, there is sometimes you feel this expectation. It's like it gnaws on you. You don't know why, and you want to break out of it. And I kind of needed, and I think I figured out a way to do that with Sadvertising. Even though it is a book about the way I see the world, there's also there's 3 stories subtly woven through the book, which are called Meta Ennis. And these are stories that kind of explored myself. It's about exploration of myself and the kind of, I guess, the idea of marginalization or identity. And even thinking back on, Nam Lee is a really good example of somebody who's kind of broke that mold. You know, a book of 6 stories. There's like there's an assassin in Colombia in there. A guy with hemorrhoids in New York. It's amazing. You don't really get that from a lot of.
Yeah.
Which is also kind of like a redundant term.
Yeah. Do you want to read a little story?
Sure.
Let's do it.
In particular, I do want to read one story.
Well, I love the opening one, but
I want to read a story called Consumatum Est. It's not titled. It's actually supposedly from the research that I've done. It's supposed to be the last words of Jesus Christ at the cross, and it's finished. The reason why I chose this title because I kind of wanted to draw a parallel between these characters who work in advertising, who think they're so holy, and they've achieved something and they've gone, this is it. So there was a thought around that. And it just happened to be this kind of title that I just felt was right for the story. I'll just read it to you. It's very short. Consumatum Est. On Friday evening, at about midnight, after working a 63-hour week, 2 strategists banded together and agreed they'd no longer use the word ever again. It's offensive, one said. Yes, the other agreed, but innovation. It mocks us, treats us like insatiable materialists. The other nodded in agreement again. It's dangerously myopic, he then said. Narrows human life to the mere act of ingestion. How has it survived for so long? It's profoundly dehumanizing. That tells you, the other said. Our industry allows its dogged persistence. We must act, screamed the other. They got up from their chairs. They stood, faced each other and yelled, are we eyeballs? No. Are we butts on seats? No. Are we data points? No. Are we just users on purchasing paths? No. Then let's do this, they yelled, and embraced each other like comrades in battle. Immediately, they got to work. They scoured the agency's service for every accessible document they could find, every brief, copy deck, contract, strategy, media, and comms plan, an upcoming pitch deck, every keynote and PowerPoint presentation. No matter what information it contained, if it had at some point contained the offensive word, it no longer did. Now, instead of consumer, it read human. When they finished, they sat back, sighed, and mused on their triumph over a few glasses of fine Scotch. They felt real catharsis, and both agreed that was what we felt after a real act of defiance. One of the strategists then proceeded to call his girlfriend and tell her about the rebellious deed. The other didn't have anyone else to call. He pushed his chair back, stretched his feet out on the table, and began to wonder what it would be like to live through a revolution.
So why short stories and why microfiction, flash fiction that's got various names? But I mean, one of the things I really loved about it was the kind of brevity of some of the stories. I think the shortest one in the book, not even 300 words, or maybe just over. I think the longest one is just over 5,000. You read a lot of short stories.
I do.
Right?
I mean, there's a number of reasons why, but I just really feel like this book could be told as a novel. Like, it was impossible. There's so many stories. Like, I had so many. And at times I did want to write as an evolvement center to do this, to write short stories. And I did think about that. And I think with NAM, we kind of discussed it at length in terms of what should link and what shouldn't. But I think it had to do with amounts. I had a lot of things that I wanted to touch on. There's a lot of moments, there's a lot of incidents, there's a lot of things that I wanted to draw attention to. And it was just impossible to do that. It was impossible to do that through a novel. Like, I just didn't really think it was possible. Even though through writing Sadvertising, there's two stories where I've developed the character, which now has to be one. So there is something about the aggression of consumerism, the act of working in the industry, that has allowed me to develop a story that I think can work as a novel. But this book.
And have you always wanted to write like the super short ones, or is that just something that happened?
It just happened, yeah. I think
you said all you needed to say in 300 words.
Yeah, I mean, I've been writing since I was 19 or 20 or however long, but and I've written very long. Tried to write. Sadvertising was a very strange, because it happened in an office when we were kind of launching this really, really huge website, and there was a lot of frustration. It was like, it was a team. We worked together for like 9 to 10 months, and it was this, I don't know, it was fatigue. It was like working to really late nights, and I just needed something to, other than like smoking too much, to just do. And I started reading this book by this guy called Osama. He was a Syrian writer who was based out of Chicago. It was beautiful. It was like characters with time and sand. It was just magical. And that really just opened up my mind. And I kind of thought, what if the person that I work with who's an experienced designer, what if they had no empathy? All about empathy. What if they just didn't have empathy? What if the designer had no imagination? So these questions, like I asked myself these serious questions. It was very silly, but and that's how I started writing. So it's like immediately, like I had the voice. I hope this happens to me again in my writing life. But I had the voice. It just came in my head, and then every time I wrote another story, I could hear that Sadvertising voice.
I know when I don't know if you know, but when we were doing the audio book, so our audio team will always send the publisher like their who they think would be good for the voice first, and then they'll maybe no, and then they'll send it to the author. And the first couple I got through, they just sounded like too young and kind of. I always imagined the narratorial voice to be much more like God. And I think we got a voice that was sort of closer to.
It was not natural.
Yeah. And this, for those of you who haven't read it yet, there's 3 stories in the book called Meta Ennis 1, 2, and 3. And I loved the line in the readings review, which I thought was a great review. Your review is very good too.
Oh, yeah.
Which says that he doesn't so much break the fourth wall as smash it into tiny little bits. Did you always know that you wanted to kind of insert yourself or a version of yourself or an authorial version of yourself or a kind of playful version of yourself into the work, or did that sort of happen organically?
I did have some idea. And I think initially when I was kind of working on the collection, I had one story, which is the first story, Meta Ennis 1, which I kind of discussed with Nan Lee. Like, I want to write more fiction. That is something that I really like exploring, the metafictionality of an author injecting himself into the story. And I kind of felt I can actually do it this way. Like, the book allows it, it gives me the ability to do that. So yeah, I think also it kind of, I didn't intend to do that. But when I stepped back and thought about the book, I was like, I kind of felt a little bit detached, almost like everything just kind of sprang out of my measure. And I just felt I needed something in there that really interrogated me. And it was also a really good challenge to vulnerable space to kind of go through. And then when I started working on the second Meta Ennis story, that's when Nam and I started discussing this idea of a trilogy. How about we just make the last one into the fourth? It took me a while to finish that last one. I had to.
Yeah. It's the longest one in the book.
It's the longest, yeah. So I had to. I couldn't. It was locked down, and I ended up like we had this like brief moment where like, hey, we're on lockdown, and like I booked this like house somewhere, Warrnambool for 10 days, and that's where I went. I went there to work on this. I hope I did.
Do you think, because often the stories will start with a line, and we also made the sort of design choice to kind of bold that line, and then they'll kind of end with a punchline, and often when you're working through them, it's like, this kind of needs a story. Did you deliberately do that in the sense that it sort of works a bit like the arc of an ad? I always thought that that's what I liked about it.
Yeah, I mean, through as an aspiring writer, they always say like you have to. First sentence. It's got to be the sentence. You write a good sentence, so the work doesn't work. So that's always in the back of your mind. It's also quite scary that the stories are so brief. But I kind of started thinking about it like a headline. It's like, what's attention grabbing in? How can the story work by just starting? Like, why does it? Do I have to elaborate on anything? Like I can elaborate on some of the longer stories, but this one just bang, just go for it. So I think. There was a lot of momentum in terms of when I started writing them. Like I would just often that's how the concepts came to me. I would just have the first line. That's all I had. I didn't have a story, just the first line. So yeah, I'm one of those writers who like the story develops as I write it. Like, often it's just a concept that I have a thought, and I have a general idea, but I don't know what's going to happen. But like I said, I had the voice. So, and I just had, it's kind of hard to explain. It's just the voice is just there.
And as well as being funny and wry and satirical, that a lot of them are quite surreal. Is that something that, I know that a lot of the, particularly Bud Solomon, is that? Yeah. So he was a big influence, or he's a big influence on you. I actually hadn't read any of his work until I met you, and then I went and read his collected stories.
Well, I Nam introduced you.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
Vice versa.
So was that an influence, or was that just another thing that kind of happened as well? I think I want to write surrealism.
No, it wasn't. I mean, I've always had a tendency, in all of even my previous work, I've always had a tendency to kind of to try and reach the most absurd conclusion to any narrative. Like I look for that. So it's like any story I wrote always had to reach something silly, and not in a silly way. Also, I started recently rewatching Seinfeld. I don't know why, but and I thought I was like, maybe there is some subconscious influence of they always try and go for something the stupidest, craziest thing. Yeah, and I've always written like that. It was I always try and look for something that would take me to the absurd, because in reality, sometimes you don't really, you just have to tweak a little bit, and it's that shit. Like, and I think, yeah, I think it's also kind of my sense of optimism that I just kind of. So I've never really thought that the stories are particularly morbid.
No, but I think there is a sense of sadness in some of them, definitely. A sense of ennui and trappedness.
Yeah. Well, consumerism.
Yeah. That's the thing, isn't it? It traps you, but it's also kind of
Makes you feel good.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you're constantly chasing the next serotonin here to really know what you kind of find next. But I actually don't necessarily think that's bad. And so you said in a recent in an interview recently that you think I don't know whether this is just a line to kind of steal it for the person interviewing you, but you thought Sadvertising is where Mad Men meets Black Mirror meets The Office. Anyone who read your boasting, I think that's a pretty.
I think it's a summary.
Good line. Yeah.
But yeah, I have. You sometimes have to try and relate it to something. I think it's impossible not to find a correlation with work. Like there's always something that exists somewhere in the timeline of creation that's similar. I've always kind of felt that there is if you combine those three things and shook it and added a bit of more humor, you'd probably get Sadvertising.
Also, a lot of this happens in these kind of bland, featureless, offices where these kind of work drones kind of labour to produce things that will sell to your toothpaste or whatever. But there's still gods and muses who kind of stalk this world, and all sorts of crazy stuff happens. So there's a bit of that kind of Walter Mittiness of it. And you're never quite sure whether that's actually happening to these people or whether they're just kind of indulging in these flights of fantasy to keep themselves sane. No, and I think there's also that great juxtaposition between, advertising loves to think of itself as a creative industry, and people write all sorts of books about how to be creative in advertising. But at the end of the day, what the end result of that creativity is just selling another slab of gear or
function.
Yeah. And so I think that's there's a tension in that.
Yeah.
Inherently in advertising, and there's a tension too.
Yeah. I think there is. I think in all of those, in all words, there's a sense of tension, and I think you need tension for creativity. It's like it's something that pulls you, and you need to resolve it in some kind of way, because it's trying to understand humanness. You go through tensions, and
brands literally come to life, which is a really funny comment on. That's what all these people strive for, is to kind of bring brands to life.
It's an awesome book.
Hello, welcome to True Talent. Seriously, man.
Do you want to read that on?
Yeah, I mean, there is a story in the book called "Brand of the Living," which is really important for me to write, because I've always been obsessed with branding, like the process of branding. It's one of the most existential things. It's essentially about prescribing meaning into an inanimate object, such as a book or toothpaste or glass or wine. So you go through this process where you're trying to give something purpose. You're trying to give it values. You're trying to give it principles. You're trying to humanize it. And it's a really big term. Like everything we've done with branding so far is really about humanizing it as much as possible, so people feel a connection. And feel connection through sharing experiences as humans.
There's something in it that they self-identify with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Self-identity, you find something, a value, a principle that you think, I like that brand works for me. And I want to spend $1,000. So I've always thought that was really weird. And I've never really understood why it just works. It works as a concept, as a strategy, as a tool. So I wanted to try and encapsulate that in the story. So there's a story where a brand literally becomes alive. And it's this kind of came from this play logo by something. And it was kind of my way of trying to say, if I reach the furthest conclusion of humanization of brands, it's a brand becoming alive. What happens? Read the story.
That's quite a long one, though.
It's a long one. I like to read. I'll read one more if I. I think a lot of the work I also try to really I kind of eliminated a sense of place in Sadvertising, and the intention was to kind of create this non-place, because most of these incidents can happen in offices. And if you're a copywriter in Madrid, you kind of understand it even if you're in Melbourne. But I want to read this story to you. It's called Contenting. It's also very short. Contenting, page 202. The problem with the content department was that no one was content with the content they were writing. A peculiar melancholy lurked amongst the writers. Each time they wrote a new piece of content, the conglomerates they worked for, be it Toyota, Google, Lancome, or HSBC, sadness slittered over their spines like a creeper. Pervaded their bodies, their minds, their hearts. They slouched more, spoke less, found it difficult to complete their tasks. Only after hours of relentless self-analysis, positive thinking, and confidence-boosting music would they smile again. They'd hand in their drafts to the editor, pack up their desk neatly, and head on home, convinced that all this was good. They were successful writers who were putting words together for a living, who were getting paid, and who could afford all the things they desired: regular rental payments, fashionable clothes, upmarket restaurant dinners, and boozy nights. It was worth it, and was a way better than pouring beers until 3 a.m. or slaving away in shitty. Still, they couldn't grasp why they felt so sad each time a new brief for a piece of content arrived on their desks. Often, they asked themselves why this sadness only materialized in the office. Was there a cosmic energy present that pulled them down into this feeling of joylessness? Well, there was. The sadness they were feeling was a result of the hindered happiness of their souls, who remembered the early promise the writers made to become writers of literature, not writers of ads. And so, each week, the souls of these sad copywriters gathered at the meeting table of the department to speak of their literary laments. Sinead's soul paused. She couldn't comprehend why her name suddenly appeared on the first page of Google results for articles about Toyota. All of Sinead's work for the Caris Group has been shoved back to the fourth page of results, she said. Damia's soul, who took on a strange yellowish hue, was shattered that Damia worked such long hours and no longer pursued his mystery thriller at home. He's too tired to even read. The thing that bothered me, Hannah's soul would say, isn't the writing Hannah's doing for the big conglomerates, but the fact that all her other writing, the good literary kind, is no longer commissioned. Sophie's soul, who hardly spoke these days, was afraid that Sophie was so hung up on getting paid that she had simply stopped writing poetry altogether. She's a charlatan, she'd say in general. As time went by, these laments worsened. The souls tried to convince themselves to be satisfied with the content against their names, because after all, they were still writing. Did it really matter that this writing was selling stuff? The articles are being read, Damia would say. They're receiving more attention than any other pieces they have ever written. Doesn't that count for something? When a rumor circulated that the content division was about to lose its biggest client, the souls were so excited that it popped the bottle of champagne. They hovered around to see if Sinead, Damia, Hannah, and Sophie would be made redundant. This is the disaster they need, they thought, to make them believe again that it was their duty in life to save their dreams. But after a week of prolonged waiting, the content department didn't lose its biggest client. It won more work and added 3 more writers.
So one final question from me, and then we might open it up. We've got about 4 minutes. What's next? I'd like to know.
I had a very, very powerful time writing Sadvertising. It's kind of huge concentration that allowed me to just think with this unbelievable clarity. And whilst I was writing the book, a lot of my other ideas that I've always thought were either short stories or articles just started making sense. I could just see them as bodies of work. So for a long time, I've been planning on writing a novel that looks at this kind of protagonist, a very kind of Western protagonist that goes back to his homeland for the first time. So I'm very interested in the predicament of the migrant experience. I also really like the idea of displacement. Well, obviously, most writing is about displacement. Teju Cole does this really well with one of his books. The first book that he where it wasn't really about assimilating into the culture that you came to, but it was about not assimilating to the culture you come from. So he went back to Lagos, Nigeria, and wrote this really beautiful book about observation, trying to understand where he was from. And I've always kind of wanted to do that because I've never really had issues assimilating into Australian culture. But I've kind of had a lot of struggle trying to understand Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I kind of wanted to do this novel of this guy kind of going back to the village for the first time. And it's all about Kanye. He's in the village and doesn't know how to do. So I think that's next. You better read.
I'll have something to say. Any questions from anyone? And you don't have to.
So I'm not ready for question, but I need to share or whatever.
There's a lot that I observed. A lot of it came from observation. And initially, when I started writing stories, a lot of it came from genuine office banter, stories that I've heard. But because I was quite strategic in terms of what I wanted to do with the stories about stretching out the absurdity in the narrative, reaching the absurd conclusion. That's why it just became fiction. And I've always found it very interesting when it comes to fiction itself. Like a lot of it comes from, there's this really beautiful line that says, like, you have to let the biography has to be let go in order to become fiction. And I think that's a really good way to think about it, because sometimes the reality of something doesn't make sense in the story. It kind of takes time to move away from it. But to kind of answer your question directly, I think that 98% is made up. Yeah.
Were there any stories?
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot that I didn't even include in the manuscript originally. There was a lot that we took out. We took out from the 12. So,
Yeah, and some big ones.
some massive
Yeah.
ones. There was a lot of stories that I wrote that just didn't fit the framework, didn't fit the work. So I didn't know what to do with these stories. I'd write them and I'd try and kind of weasel some way into it to make it about consumerism, advertising. It just didn't work, so I just parked it into like another short story collection. So Instagram the other day, and I was like, "Oh my god, it's advertising as an ad." So bad.
Anti, that's what I like. Anti. Beyond being anti,
Yeah. But it is kind of, it's odd. Sometimes it's odd. Yeah. The Instagram ad got me.
say that a lot. Obviously, they know who I am. Anyone else?
Good question.
That's what people say when they're trying to think. Just keep repeating the question. Very good.
No, I did get a lot of pleasure. Like I said, there was a lot. I could never conceive this book as a novel. It had to become a story collection. So I think on the day of publication, I had this true sense of accomplishment. I was like, it's done. This is whatever happens now is. But I don't think the world is left. I think my writing will always going to have a creative thread that truthfully explores advertising, consumerism, some acts of it. Because I also think that's just reality. And currently, my interests are still kind of aligned to that. They might change. I might be really into politics. But don't listen to me.
Right, well, unless anyone has anything else, we might wrap it up.
Yeah.
Thanks. This is in person.
Thank you very much. Of the book, and a lot of people have commented, especially today as I was putting up the posters, which is a constant just bringing it out. So I don't know if this is something that you're in the process that you have much to say. I've heard many other authors that say that we actually have nothing to do with the cover.
That's an interesting.
Oh,
We should tell that story.
shut us down. Maybe not.
Actually, Justin can say.
So we have a brilliant designer who works at Penguin Random House, Adam, who's won loads of awards and does some amazing designs. And I wrote him a brief, which I thought really hard about, and he came back with loads of concepts, some of which I think were really brilliant. And I just didn't feel like he was getting there. I just didn't feel like it reflected the book or the book that I had in my head. And so I rejected loads before I actually sent them to Ennis. And even the ones I sent, I wasn't completely happy with, but I got to the point where I wanted to get his point of view.
No. I think even at the beginning when we finalize, when we get a contract through, I always kind of said that I'll have a lot to say during that stage when that stage comes, and I was really holding back the moment. Yeah, I think it was, from in-house. Yeah, a lot of authors tend to just kind of go, if you think that's the right thing. But I obviously had a really big vision. I needed to be that.
I think too that I think one of the things that even though a lot of them were great, they were quite derivative.
Yeah.
And I think Adam was trying to make it look like something else.
Yeah.
And anyway, so we decided that we spoke to Adam, and he was very nice about it. That we didn't feel like we were quite getting there, and we wanted to go in another direction.
And I don't know my resumes.
Yeah.
I've had Sam McGuinness, who's the creative director and designer. I've had probably the longest kind of creative relationship. We've worked together since my first job, literally, in multiple different agencies. So it kind of he's always just had a very good understanding of me, both as a creative, as a writer, and as a human. He just knows me very intimately. So it was, I was in Sarajevo, he was in Melbourne, he finished work, we got on Zoom in the mornings and the evenings, and yeah, Sam, you just got it.
Sad face that's on it, and yeah, I just think it's beautiful. So
Well, that's actually one of the things we discussed, because our head of design loved it, but he said this looks exactly like a cover that two guys in advertising. And it didn't look particularly fiction, which is actually one of the things that I kind of liked about it, but we wanted to warm it up a bit. So the sad face wasn't always there, right? Wasn't so we brought that in just to add that bit of humanity to it, and also the line on the side, which wasn't there.
No, it's so bright sunshine.
They were fun, right?
Sam, I mean, we chose kind of like a RGB color, but we didn't kind of get into the final. The final one was
Hand time.
Yeah,
But
it
after that,
was-
it's like,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
And it's also soft touch. Which do you
like
the like a punch in the spoken word?
thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.
Please feel free to continue drinking and stats. If you'd like to purchase a book, please come and find me, and you can purchase it from up here. You don't need to go downstairs. And enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for
Thank
coming.
you.
Thank you very much.